Now let's start. Thank you very much for attending this talk when we usually are very sleepy. So I hope that the afternoon presentation from me will not put you into sleep. So my name is Huang Hui, and you can also call me Liu. And I am the standard engineer at Huawei. I am major responsible for the new business, including AI, big data, edge computing, autonomous driving, and the relevant open source and exploration of the relevant standards. So today, I'd like to briefly introduce the Kubernetes Policy Work Group. What are the progresses we have made? And before I start, I'd like to say that it should be co-presented by me and my colleague Zhipeng, but because he needed to attend other conferences, so I will be the sole speaker. And for some of the part, if I couldn't cover those details, please forgive me. What is the background of the work group? What is the initial intention? So we have already established a lot of Kubernetes 6 in each of the work group. We have the relevant policy definitions, for example, the storage policy, networking policy, certification policy. We had identified the following issues. The first one, for each of the work group, in their own subdomain, they have some meanings for solving the relevant problems, but between those different sub-areas, they cannot have a consistent policy. And secondly, in different subdomains, we need to maintain the consistent semantics, and we also lack of the statistics and management for those different policies. The second part, I'd like to introduce the positioning of the work group. We already have defined a lot of the policies, and for those already defined ones, we need to avoid reinventing those wheels. Based on the existing defined policies, we need to come up with a general framework, and we also need to focus on the end-to-end policy definitions. The design will also have the incremental improvement. What is the history of the work group? Last year, on the KubeCon, someone raised a question. In a certification and building process, we cannot reach a very satisfied result. So some of the people had a discussion, and they proposed that based on the certifications, we can have a policy definition, and this work group was established in January this year. And we also have the workplace routine meetings in the community. The major purpose of the routine meeting is to have some basic proposals and initiations, and at 7 a.m. every Thursday, Beijing time, we will have a meeting. If you're interested, you can take a look at the agenda and minutes of the conferences. Up to now, we have been joined by a lot of the members, including Google, Huawei, IBM, and Red Hat. All of those members had been engaged in our work. how does it operate? It operates in 3 ways. First of all, the policy work group had been cooperating with the other work group, including Kubernetes 6 and projects. Some are inside and some are outside the Kubernetes communities, so we coordinatively promote the policy definition of the Kubernetes projects. And secondly, we are driven by the community. All of the designs and discussions are completely open. And last but not least, the development cycle for the work group is half a year. And for each of the cycle, we will define the MVP development and review.
然后，这里就是简单介绍一下，说这个工作组到底怎么来实现我们这个。
So how do we realize our goals?
然后简单来说的话，就是
Simply put,
通过这种就前期是收集一些不同的
we would first collect the demand for the policies from the different parts, and then we would integrate those demands into a general solution. And here I have listed 3 use cases discussed in this community. The first one is the compliance of data. And here, in the second part, I use the word capacity, but you can understand it as a quota. And the third one is about cluster management. So the first one, data compliance. You must have heard of GDPR. Because of the existence of GDPR, a lot of the companies would care about whether the cluster would support or be compliant to the data management rules. So apart from GDPR, we also have PCI and some of the other data classification standards. And the second challenge is capacity or workload distribution, how to define a cluster, how to define the priorities of the resource allocation. For example, what are the tenants who need those capacities and when do they need it? And for some of the workload, they may need it from time to time. And how can we guarantee the dynamic adjustment of the workloads? About the cluster management, in the business department, you need to guarantee the consistent application of those policies. Then I like to go through these challenges one by one. First, about the data compliance. I have listed some cases. On the left-hand side, you can see there is a data compliance officer and the data controller. We can call them DCO and DC. For the DCO, in the first case, the capacity is to capture some metrics associated with compliance, and the purpose is to ensure that the policies can be implemented. And for the second DCO, DCO2, once some violations occur, incompliance happens, then we can send an alert. And for DCO3, the function is to gather some audit histories based on the compliance policies, or the DCO can gather some GDPR data. For the data controller, she can create a policy or review the audit history. and it is mainly for the purpose of managing the policies and data. Or the DC can define a process for regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of technical and organizational measures. And by doing so, she can also ensure the security of the data. So I have introduced the data compliance issues, then about the capacity. We also have some use cases to share with you. The first one, Fred needs to set some capacity reservations for different business. And then he also needs to set the different quotas for different pipelines. This is the first scenario. And the second scenario, based on the resource consumptions in different pipelines. For example, some business department occupies smaller resource and some others occupies more. Then we can have the interdepartment resource sharing or the priority of different resources. The third use case, for Kubernetes, we can treat the infrastructures equally, no matter it's the private cloud or the public cloud. We can have the unified deployment, and for the whole business lines, maybe for some of the business lines, we do not allow you to run on the public clouds. Then we can set up those policies to regulate what kind of a business can be run on the public cloud. And the fourth use case is about capacity allocation. For example, by what time or during what period of the time you can have the resource allocation. And this is for the prevention of the high concurrency or to improve the resource utilization. And the last case for capacity is how to set up a hierarchical policy. For example, we may have the sub-projects, and for each of the projects we have different demands for the resource occupations and policies, and we need to satisfy the demand of different sub-projects. And the third challenge is about cluster management. The first case, we still have a person named Fred, and Fred needs to set up some RBAC rules because the network between different departments in a large-scale company needs to be independent. The certification also needs to be independent. And how can you use the relevant policies to realize the access control among different departments? And the second use case is the isolation of the network resources and by fault between different departments. We should have isolated network. The third use case, for some privileged workload, we cannot run it in production because we have some administrator operations which may damage the production cluster. The last use case is the standardization of the policies, such as the lifecycle management, and how can we apply those policies to the newly established resources, such as a new namespace. So we have introduced some use cases in the communities, and next I'd like to introduce some public proposals. The first one is the scheduling policy. The background of this policy is that Kubernetes still have a lot to improve in role isolation. We are still in initial stage for some of the features such as toleration and priority class, also including node selector. Those features cannot be supported by the Kubernetes RBAC mechanism. So the work group had proposed a new resource in the community called scheduling policy. The purpose of this scheduling policy is to define a new resource, and then toleration and node selector can be packaged in the policy. And I'd like to briefly introduce the functions, but as for the details and the realizations, you can take a look from this link if you're interested. This is written by an expert in the community. The second proposal is the topology service policy. And this topology is mainly related with networking service. The background was that it was evaluated from the Ingress API, and this is the transfer of the networking route. For the business department, maybe it's cross AC or within the same AC when we are making a deployment, and the preferred situation is to use the local services. That's why we had proposed to make the services as the node local. That is to create a topology for networking services. By doing so, when you create a service, well, the current mechanism of Kubernetes is to randomly deploy it on a node. But if we can create a topology, then we can transfer or run the services based on your demand at the directed node. And through those links, you can see more background, because I am not specialized in this, so I cannot give you more detailed introductions. But if you're interested, you can go through those links to take a look at those proposals.
And the third resource is security profile. As for this one, is PCU's policy in security control. For these aspects, the first one is about the cluster bootstrapping configuration, for example, like the command line flags, file permissions, etc. And also for access to the documentations as well. And then for cluster, we also have our policy configuration. For example, we have the policy security policy here as a concept, and also we have the namespace scoped policy objects, for example, like the network policy. And on the right, you can see the spec. The resource name is Newspeak Kempton. Besides all the three aspects I've just mentioned, we talk about the policy in networking security as well as deployment, and also we have other proposals in other areas. And here, the first one, as I've just talked about, the three use cases in data control, for example, like the audit as well as compliance. And the second one is about the resource policy. That is the resource allocation policy. And we have 2 pages later to talk about our findings, the irreversibility of deletion as an issue, and also how we're going to do the quota control in a multi-tenant quota policy environment. And lastly, policy working group will actually generate a holistic architecture which builds upon these proposals. And as for deletion irreversibility, such an issue is Kubernetes. When an issue proposed by the man, he explained that there's an incubator, which is called Service Incubator, that is to integrate the third-party systems, for example, the cloud service, and we can do that through the component of syscruboot, and then we through SVC cat will be able to do the checkup for the resources. It's just like a service management. And as for each of the requirement or demand, for QA, it has various concepts. We have to include information of the users, for example, the verification information, the audit information, and under this circumstance, for us, it might reject the information sent from the source. For example, the failure of verification. And as for the service, it involves some of the demand in business world and so on. And a service book broker turns down the request, then we wouldn't be able to know whether the demand is accepted or rejected. And lastly, for the verification mechanism, if we want to resolve it, then we will have to use the Kubernetes verification mechanism available at the moment. And we have the RBAC rules and admission controller as well. And here are some examples. For broker, if it rejects for updated measures, it's reversible because the users can still update the spec to enable the rolling back. But as for operation, it's problematic because for the deletion, it's irreversible. If we just trigger a delegation and then I just regret, then I have to bring it back, and that's really impossible at the moment. For here, besides the operation I've just talked about, the controller will also supervise the time chart here. It will also lead to the irreversible operation. After this question has been discussed, I feel like it's an initiative to make full use of the mechanism at the present to resolve this issue. First of all, if with the RBAC at the moment we cannot really map all dynamic complex business because for RBAC we don't really have the resources or logic for the dynamic complicated issues. And we cannot just bring that to the RBAC rules. And as for the second one, it's admission controllers. For this option, generally speaking, there is no dry run operation available. In most cases, it's not available for us to use. Even if it was, we still need to deal with the real operation. And the other one is shadow resources. In this way, the Kubernetes users interact with the shadow resource. Then for some of the failed delete request, we will be able to recreate it. We can resolve this issue in this way, but it's really complicated. While at the same time, while the controllers are watching their shadow resources, they may lead to new and other irreversible actions. And as for the last two ones, that is to use delete and custom delete. For this kind of mechanism, that is to make a delete requested flag. For the result, we'll be able to do the definition for the time stamp, and that can help us to resolve the issue of irreversibility. For custom delete, it's similar, but the difference is that it will forbid the use of the delete functions. For some of the examples I've just mentioned, I want to make the point that there are some ways to resolve the delete issue and try to achieve the rolling back. And next one, we'll have the policy working group planning. From this picture, you can see the working group members. They're actually from different companies. And what we are doing at the moment is to work for the version 1.13. Basically, two parts here. The first one is the running items. As you can see on the screens, altogether 7 items of them. If you're interested, you could refer to the links to see how it will be implemented. And also, there are some of the recommended policy resource format. Yes, it's a format. Besides Kubernetes Policy Group, we're now working with the SEIF working group to establish the CNCF-hosted working group. And as for this working group, it's basically for the sake of security and also the protection of the safety issues, policy control and safety for operators, administrators, and developers. And as for the members of this working group, they are the companies listed on the screen. And also, for tomorrow, 14:20, still in the same venue, there will be another colleague of me who will dive into the policy working group. As for today's session, I'll just do a brief introduction. As for tomorrow's session, we'll have 3 speakers with us who will respectively talk about the status quo as well as the detailed information about the policy working group here. Besides, as for tomorrow, to be specific, tomorrow evening, there is a Chris Wang's, which is a Spanish restaurant, will have a small-scale meetup there. And if you're really interested in it, please feel free to join us. As for online communication, we have already established a WeChat group, and there's a QR code on the screen. If you're interested, please scan it and join us. Maybe in this WeChat group, we can exchange our views in terms of the policy, the issues, and also some of our requirements in technologies. And basically, that's it for my speech today. Do you have any questions at the moment? Is it because after deletion and you got a catalog and you cannot reverse it? For Kubernetes, after we trigger the deletion, then the state of it will be deleted. If the subroot rejects that, then the entire request will be turned down and will not coming back. And there's no way for us to change the state of deleted to the normal state, and that's it. For updated, you can manually send another request. If there's no more question, then that's it for my speech. Thank you.